And if you could either move the,
Oh,
that or point the microphone towards your mouth, it's directional, believe it or not. Well, it's between you not speaking directly into the microphone and that being there makes it difficult to hear your questions.
I apologize. And again, there's no way we don't have a blood test that tells us what the measure of lactic acidosis was at this particular time, the times in the video.
Correct. In a hospital, we would do a blood test to measure lactate.
And then, of course, with respect to lactic acidosis, it's very person dependent. Is that right?
Well, it is in the sense that highly trained Olympic athletes might be able to exert more before entering this phase of metabolism where they produce excess lactic acidosis, and somebody who's very out of shape would enter into that sooner with less physical activity.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to understand is that it sort of depends on a person's cardiovascular abilities, right?
Yes.
And here we have a young man who is in his 20s, right?
Yes.
Age can be a factor, right?
Correct.
And we also know, I think you learned this, that he was an avid runner, right?
He ran. Yes.
Ran. And we're talking here about a struggle that lasted, the whole thing that you've been asked to review is under 20 minutes, the whole thing, right?
Yes.
And the exertion piece of it goes back to that approximate 2.5 minutes.
Yes.
And I understand that please understand, I'm paraphrasing. I could be seconds off, but we're talking about the exertion piece being a fragment of the overall encounter.
Yes.
And finally, the topic of hypoxia. Same thing, we can't know for sure without a test, right?
Correct. Well, I want to clarify, we can't know the degree of it without the test.
I appreciate that. So again, anyone's oxygen levels are depleted. That is a spectrum, right?
Yes.
Going back to even a 2.5 minute struggle, when you're using energy has some effect, given the exertion, right?
Yes, it also depends on the person. So a healthy person can tolerate low oxygen better than an unhealthy person.
And so the idea of hypoxia is also a spectrum. Same thing. You can go hike. Trying to think of a good example nearby. You go hike Flatirons or take a hike. You will have some hypoxia.
I hope not, but maybe if you get up to a 14,000 foot, you might have a little bit. Yeah.
You can. We take these high drives and go to. Hypoxia itself is not lethal.
Yeah, it depends on the person, but in a healthy person, short term, it's not.
You talked about what you relied on in part for diagnosing hypoxia was what you believe to be a change in mental status that you can discern from a video. Is that right?
Yes.
You are looking for these changes as a doctor, right?
Yes.
And you're looking for possible explanations for what's going on, in fairness.
Yeah, kind of starting with that change in mental status and trying to go back and figure out what possibly could be the explanations.
What possibly could be. Okay. And you had said with respect to the hypoxia, and I'm paraphrasing, so tell me if this is not right. There's no other explanation for the change. So, quote, at this point, he is probably hypoxic or has no oxygen to some degree, right?
Yes, because like he didn't have no one beat him in the head or caused a brain injury, or he wasn't. We know from his toxicology report that he wasn't on substances that could alter his mentation. So we talked. If it wasn't yesterday, it's been in the past. I've talked about how the two things that could alter mental status related to his respiratory status are low oxygen and that high carbon dioxide.
And the range between probably hypoxic or no oxygen to some degree. Am I correct to assume that's also sort of a spectrum?
Yeah, I guess I'm sorry if I said no oxygen to some degree, because that sounds just awful. But we know the oxygen had to be abnormal.
But it's an unknown in terms of the severity.
The severity is unknown.
No. And part of what you were looking at is sort of just how and whether he is continuing to interact with the police officers, right?
Yes.
Um, and you say that he basically stops responding in some way, right?
Yes.
The actual clip that they played for you, where you are noting that he's not responding, it's where that sergeant is asking him if he's taken any drugs. Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember that clip.
And he's not saying anything back. That's what we were asked to look at, right?
Yes.
And you think his mental status may have changed simply because he's not answering the question, right?
No. See, I reviewed all the videos.
Sure.
And so there's more than just that episode where he is very abnormally not responding to stimuli sometimes, painful stimuli even.
Okay.
So we see a big change from talkative, granted short sentences because he's short of breath, to saying stranger things, to yes, no answers, or maybe no answers. But we looked at like 10 minutes of video here.
Well, and I appreciate you pointing that out because you had the ability to just look at him continuously, right?
Yes.
You're not living this real time, of course, right?
Yeah, and also it's not entirely continuous, right? We have overlapping video from different perspective.
But you're able to use all that overlap to put together, in hindsight, a chronology, right?
Yes.
And that chronology relies on the perspective of different people seeing different things at different times.
Yes.
You're able to look at it all together.
Yes.
But when Sergeant Leonard was asking him, are you taking anything? Are you on anything? And I'm paraphrasing. Did you actually hear on the video that he responded to that question?
I don't recall hearing him respond.
You didn't hear him say Mary?
Mary.
Hmm?
That would be unusual, wouldn't it?
No, not at all. Was it marijuana in his system?
Well, I guess you could speculate, sure.
Oh, I'm not asking you to speculate. I thought you said that in the toxicology report, there was evidence of marijuana.
There was.
So if he's asked a question, what are you on? What are you on? And his response is Mary.
And the court's going to direct the jury that it's up to them to determine who said what on the video, not counsel in the case.
Thank you, Your Honor. You didn't hear that response.
I did not hear that.
In terms of evaluating his change in mental state, you said he was saying things to you that seemed strange to you, right?
Yes.
Of course, I know this is a very glib question. You had never met Mr. McClain, right?
Sure.
I mean, things that he's saying that seem strange to you, you have no way to know whether they're strange for him.
Well, they could be strange compared to his previous. It's the change in status that I was referring to.
Okay, over the course of just this time frame.
Yeah, so there's a difference in this time.
Just kind of putting this all together in this particular case, and I want to talk about each one just very briefly. It was the aspiration that you have been asked to opine about is not what caused Mr. McClain to die, the aspiration alone.
No, that's not my opinion.
Just one moment. I want to go back to something. Just back to this idea that he was so deteriorating. You said that your opinion is not that the aspiration did not cause his death. Is that what
There are a
what
lot
you
of
were saying?
doubts in that.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
Can you rephrase that,
Sure.
maybe?
Well, I asked you, with respect to aspiration, any event of aspiration in this case is not what caused Mr. McClain to die.
That's not correct.
Okay. So in your report, when you say,
Can we show it to him?
sure. And I think it is better to talk about a specific time frame. Maybe that's better for me. So I want to talk to you about before the injection of ketamine. If I could draw your attention to that.
Okay.
Prior to the administration of ketamine, aspiration did not cause Mr. McClain to die.
I'm not even comfortable with that because that's not what I've ever been asked necessarily to opine on. That my opinion is that the aspiration, the hypoxia, and the acidosis were risk factors that made the severity of the reaction to ketamine greater, the risk greater. So it's a series of events that increase his risk over a normal, healthy human that made the ketamine more likely to be deadly, is my opinion.
Understood. So what I'm asking to clarify is that before ketamine is administered, in light of all of these other things that you have opined are occurring, the aspiration by itself did not cause death.
Yeah, I would support that. He was, I think I have said in the past that he's more likely than not to, if he received immediate medical attention at that point, he is more likely than not able to survive. And part of the reason that there was that supplement 2-page thing was to say, what if we stop there? And that was to just hone in and get specific that, people can still have some damage to their lung or long-term problems from some of what he experienced before the ketamine if he got medical attention. And he could have recovered fully, or he could have maybe had a partial recovery, but he was more likely to live than to die before the ketamine.
Okay, so that kind of cuts to the chase. So pre-ketamine, if we put all of these things together, what you believe occurred, aspiration, hypoxia, and acidosis. If everything occurred exactly how you believe it did, those three things did not cause his death prior to the ketamine injection.
Correct. By themselves, they were insufficient to guarantee that he was going to die.
And then we have to break down the time frame of the aspiration a little bit more, because we know that there's this continued period of aspiration events, right?
Yes.
So I want to talk about post-ketamine and pre-ketamine just a little bit more, because today you are saying that there was some aspiration event prior to the ketamine injection, correct?
Correct.
And we walked through how we can't know the severity or measure how much, right?
Correct.
But today you are certain, or to a degree of medical certainty, you are willing to testify that there was aspiration before the ketamine injection.
Yes.
Now, if the aspiration event that occurred with the mask did not happen, hypothetically, you still have a continuum of aspiration post-ketamine that was significant.
Yes.
And the continuum of aspiration post-ketamine is apparent, right?
Yes.
Longer in duration.
Well, we don't know that. But yes.
Well, events occurring over a longer duration.
Correct.
You have previously testified that events before the administration of ketamine may have included aspiration, but did not otherwise materially impair his breathing or cause his arrest. Do you remember saying that in your report?
Yes.
And so in your report, your opinion is that events before ketamine may have included aspiration, right?
Yes.
And you were relying on the information that you had at the time that there is vomit in the mask.
Yes.
You also noted, or you have opined, that he was able to articulate his concerns and tried to explain his situation with statements such as, quote, I am an introvert, respect my boundaries, end quote, and quote, I'm different, I'm so sorry, I don't do that stuff, end quote. This demonstrates at least adequate mental and pulmonary function. Do you remember writing that?
Yes.
You were asked a lot of questions yesterday about a carotid hold. Do you remember?
Yes.
You had demonstrated yesterday, I think you, forgive me if I'm not remembering this right, but you kind of did something with your hand on your throat. Do you remember? The reason I'm asking you this, you've also referred to this as a chokehold, Dr. Buther. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Do you understand that there is a significant distinction between a carotid control hold and a chokehold?
I think I previously testified I'm not an expert on how these things are done. I just can be an expert in neuroscience and know that the purpose is to cut off blood supply to the brain to cause a brief loss of consciousness. I'm probably the last person to ask as to how you achieve that. So I would be the expert in what the medical effects are, but not how to do that.
Well, in order to determine what the medical effects are, you certainly have to understand what was done to the person, right?
That's incorrect.
You don't have to know what was done to the person to know what the medical.
If the outcome is a loss of consciousness by cutting off blood supply to the brain, I don't care how you did that. I can tell you what that effect would be.
Okay. Certainly, how a carotid hold is applied matters if you're being asked questions about it in a criminal trial.
I don't understand.
I'm happy to withdraw the question.
Sustain.
You have opined that even after an apparent carotid hold or chokehold and brief loss of consciousness reported by law enforcement while detained on the ground by at least 2 officers, I observed he appeared to be verbalizing appropriately, stating he was in pain, and continuing to struggle physically, which is not possible without adequate respiratory, cardiac, and neurologic function. Do you remember writing that in your report?
Yes.
You have also testified regarding the carotid hold that if you do it temporarily, it doesn't kill you, right?
Yes.
And you have testified that that is not the reason Elijah McClain died.
Yes.
But yet you were asked questions yesterday about whether that carotid hold just started this whole sequence of events. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember there was some conversation about that.
Yeah. And doctor, your answer was, and you didn't say yes, your answer was, well, he was there at the start of the events, right? The person who did the carotid.
Yeah, I think we're talking, this is not a black and white situation. So yes, no is not a full expression of my opinions or my understanding.
But your answer that somebody was present at the start of a sequence of events was in response to the question about whether that event caused the sequence of events. Do you remember that question yesterday?
Okay, we can give them the direct quote or show them the transcript.
I'll find it, Your Honor. sure I get the wording. You were asked a question about your concerns. Do you remember Ms. Joyce using the words, so you have these concerns, right?
So you weren't the only one asking a lot of questions. I don't remember all the questions from yesterday. It was a long day.
Actually, very fair. So if you were asked the question, and if you don't remember, that's okay. So you have concern about acidosis, hypoxia, that he is aspirated. And did that all start with the carotid hold? Starting the sequence with the carotid hold. Do you remember being asked about whether that started all of these concerns?
Yes.
And your answer was, it is after the carotid that you see Mr. McClain is actually the most alert before he deteriorates later in the sequence of events.
I think so, but you're maybe attributing a different meaning to that statement than what was intended. Because when I say adequate, that means you're not dead. I'm a critical care doctor, and you know, if you have adequate lung and neurologic function to speak, my main concern about the carotid hold was that I'm very familiar with strangulation injuries, hanging, other sorts of trauma to the neck, and was very concerned that there could be some damage, right, to the neck. And we know that was not the case.
Yeah.
And so that's really the spirit of that was, we have an autopsy that says there wasn't damage to the structures of the neck from an improperly placed hold. And I'm seeing somebody who can talk. So obviously there's some air moving through their airway. That's all I'm saying.
I appreciate that. So in that way, you were able to rule out the carotid hold.
That's mostly what that was about, if I recall.
Perfect. And of course, to your point, I mean, when you're writing these things, you have a tremendous amount of experience and expertise that we don't have. So what you may pick up on, the layperson may not. Would you agree with that?
I would agree.
Thank you. All right. Just a couple more topics. The final topic I wanted to ask you about is ketamine. You are familiar with ketamine.
Yes.
The ketamine in this case, you have opined, was 1.7 to 1.8 times higher than what it should have been, right?
Yes.
You have characterized the ketamine dose in this case as abnormally high, right?
Yes.
It was more than deep induction anesthesia dose.
Yes.
This drug is a very dangerous medication. Would you agree?
It's only dangerous in circumstances where you're using it on the wrong type of patient or in the wrong type of situation, or when there isn't adequate monitoring and plans for in case there are reactions. So when we do sedation for procedures in the medical world, it's very controlled.
Mhm.
And we're only giving it to patients that truly need it. And we always have a plan that if something bad happens, we have a plan B and a C and a D to recover from that. So it's a drug that is safe when used properly. That's probably how I clarify it.
It is a drug that requires all of those protocols to avoid its potential dangers.
Absolutely. And it's probably more about that than the dose, but the dose was also high.
Well, has to be supervised by a physician, right?
I don't know if it has to be supervised by a physician, but someone who has experience and training to monitor and to respond to adverse events.
You said plan B, C, D. There are multiple sort of life-saving measures that you have at the ready when this drug is used.
Yes.
You require medical personnel should be monitoring a patient very closely before it is given.
Assessing them before it's given, yes.
Better word, assessing a patient and then closely monitoring a patient as soon as it is given.
Yes.
In this case, the medical personnel did not perform an assessment.
Correct.
The medical personnel did not perform any real monitoring after it was given.
Correct.
There's equipment for that, right?
Yes.
It's very specific equipment to monitor someone who's been dosed with ketamine.
Yes.
That equipment is used by medical professionals.
Yes.
That equipment, did you see the paramedics sort of left on the curb? It's not in their possession?
I heard them talk about it, but not use it. And then I saw that they maybe had their kind of to-go bag with the equipment, but that they didn't open that up. And the first time I thought I saw any of that type of monitoring was in the ambulance.
You have testified that the injection of ketamine stopped Mr. McClain's breathing.
Yes.
You have testified that there is no safe dose of ketamine.
Yeah, this goes back to it's more than just the dose, it's the plan that you have, because some people can be really sensitive and some people not.
I was just going to ask you, you don't know how someone is going to respond to ketamine.
Yes.
Even if you take out hypoxia, acidosis, aspiration, there are still very serious risks with ketamine.
Yes.
And you said this earlier, but there is no evidence that Mr. McClain would not have survived if he had not been given ketamine.
Let me slow down here. So there, ask that again, please.
I'm happy to. In this case, you were saying earlier that there is no evidence that Mr. McClain would not have survived, would not have recovered if he had not been given ketamine.
Yes.
Couple more questions and I will be done. Your Honor, I'm going to reference the chart. If I speak really loudly, is that okay to stand over here? Or do you?
That's fine. Yeah, I just need to make sure I hear what the questions are.
Chart that you were asked to walk through with those video exhibits yesterday. Because looks familiar.
Yes.
And I just want to look just at the chronology, because I've been asking you about sort of the duration of this event and estimating. So they asked you at the beginning, the Rodina camera, to characterize Mr. McClain in healthy physical exertion. You didn't find that.
Yes.
If we go down, we have Woodyard exhibits right here. But we're talking about the deterioration, again, that you're able to see with the benefit of all of the different cameras, right?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Different officers. This is where Sergeant Leonard is present. Mr. McClain is short of breath, speaking only a few words, right? Looking for after music? Where you believe it's apparent. I remember you talking about someone needs to call 911. And once you see what's going on.
Yes. Well, I think it's probably more on that page that you were just on, if you could flip one page. So that sleepy, needs medical attention, hardly breathing. That's his mental status changes. It's a continuum. He says some things that seem a little strange, but I think what was really convincing is he started to really not breathe adequately and become less responsive. And that's where, as a medical professional, I'm starting to get really alarmed at what he looks like in that Exhibit 188 ward video right there.
Okay, because that's what I was getting at. There's sort of this progression, but then when they ask you, like, here's where someone should be calling 911. We're sort of into Officer Ward's camera at 22:59, where he looks sleepy and he looks like he needs medication.
Yes.
So, no, that officers had called for medical assistance. Someone may have been somewhere. Someone had called. Did you know that?
I don't know the exact time, but I recall that they had called for assistance early on, yes.
Oh, that's okay, but they had questions about someone you can hear and what's taking so long, waiting for medical help, right?
Yes,
In here.
yes,
And you were asked questions about, it's really the job of the people who are calling 911 to give as much information as possible, right?
yes,
And of course, we should strive to do that, right?
yes,
It's also the job of medical personnel, such as yourself, to try to ascertain that information, right?
yeah, it's a team.
It's a team, and it should be, right? Some people are better at that than others, in your experience. Would you agree?
That I would of course agree with that.
I appreciate that. Well, because some people who are trying to get someone help, they don't have the bird's eye view you had.
Judge, this is speculation about what some people might.
No, this is not asking him to speculate. I'm asking him his review compared to what he has seen in the evidence.
Well, if you're asking him what somebody else might have seen or observed, the court will sustain that part of the objection.
Without going into what someone else did or did not see, certainly in your practice, you have experienced times where people are not giving doctors the information that doctors wish they would have.
Yes,
And sometimes the information that you know is pertinent, a layperson doesn't.
As a judge, she's asking them to speculate about what.
Sustain.
Well, I'll ask you a different question. You know from your background and your expertise how to recognize certain signs of respiratory distress, right?
yes,
People come to you to try to understand those things, right?
yes,
And you used the example yesterday that, if someone was saying, and forgive me if it was something different, but I think it was, I'm having chest pain, because you were asked about the notion that there were times Mr. McClain had been saying during this chronology that he couldn't breathe, right?
yes,
And that's something someone should have said to the paramedics, correct?
yes,
Of course, there's lots of people present, correct?
yep,
And I think you made a different example, which is that if you hear someone saying, I'm having chest pain, is that the example?
yes,
Thank you. I'm having chest pain, that if that person having chest pain had been expressing that and is later being treated, a person who heard that surely should say that to the medical people. You hope that would happen.
I would expect it of any layperson.
You would expect it, and sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't.
That's fair.
In fact, hypothetically speaking, if I see somebody having a heart attack saying, my chest hurts, you would expect I would know that's a heart attack.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but yeah, that's fair. Some lay people would put those two together and say yes.
Sure. Well, in hindsight, if someone I know is having a heart attack and I say, I should have said this to the police, something that I learn later does not necessarily inform what I understood then. Would you agree?
Sustain.
There's just a couple more questions I have for you on this chart. move on from when 911 should have been called. And it gets worse. Moment Mr. McClain needed intervention potentially, testified about less active. He's got to have attention here and then goes to, looks like he's not breathing.
It keeps getting worse, yes.
So he's talking about a sequence of events, and I just want to focus your attention on a moment in time. There is a moment in time here where he may need help. We talked about that, right? But he is alive.
Yes.
And we talked about not only is he alive, but he is in a position with treatment to fully recover, right?
Potentially, yes.
The sequence, this moment in when the paramedics arrive, they are the people we're asking for. That's the reason for 911, right?
You know, what I heard is we want ketamine. Sounded like a work order to me, but yes, you're right. I don't remember. But that was the rationale, I think, early on for calling, was to get ketamine, not necessarily because there was at first an initial medical concern.
So we called the police and or called the medics and whether that had said.
Yeah, I don't recall, but they showed up and they're medics, so.
So the medic there is alive. Focus on this.
Okay.
Medics have taken over the treatment.
I didn't see that in the video, to be honest.
Well, the medics are on scene.
They're on scene, but they have not assumed control of the situation.
They're there and they're
Okay.
Said something yesterday that I thought was very instructive when you were asked about these different concerns and issues, the acidosis, the hypoxia. You said, we have the ingredients, but we don't have the recipe. Do you remember saying that?
Correct. Yep.
And by having the ingredients, we have these different risk factors, right?
Yes.
We have things that may have elevated Mr. McClain's risk to receive ketamine. You
Yep.
believe we did.
Absolutely.
We don't know the severity of them, right?
We know the increased risk. We don't know if they were essential to the ultimate outcome.
And so when we go back in time, back to the chart, when we go back to this moment where he is, assuming your opinion, all of these things are happening in the line.
Yes.
Made a recipe for death.
Correct.
Recipe for death in this moment required one ingredient.
No, it's more that you're making a chicken dish and the ketamine is the chicken. It is not the same dish if you have just chicken, but without the chicken, it's not the dish.
I'm going to say that if you're making a chicken dish, chicken.
You need the chicken.
And after that dose of ketamine is where it is apparent that he stops breathing.
Yes.
Finally, showed you is, as you can see, there is one person here today, right?
Yes.
Sustain.
There are a number of names on this. Number of first responders, right?
Yes.
I just want to point you to what's going on. Going on up here where it says Woodyard. I don't want to mess up their exhibit. So we have Woodyard right here. We have healthy, restrained mask on, right?
Yes.
And then we have Woodyard here for this sequence.
and it says, give up.
Yes.
Mr. Beather, I'm going to start where the defense counsel just ended.
Okay.
Do you remember on the various body worn cameras that at some point there is a view where the camera is looking up and it's apparent that it's in the grass?
Yes.
Do you know what body worn camera, who that belonged to?
No, I don't.
She asked you the question about, I'm having chest pain.
Yes.
That example that you gave yesterday. And if I remember your testimony correctly, you said that's akin to Mr. McClain saying, I can't breathe.
Yes.
Defense counsel asked you a lot about what the paramedics should have done.
Yes.
And is it your testimony that the paramedics did not do what they should have done?
Yes.
You were also asked yesterday about what the police officers should have done as far as the information they gave to the paramedics.
Yes.
If the paramedics had been given certain information, would that have changed their decision, if you know, to give ketamine?
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
I'm building the foundation, Judge, if the court would just give me a little leeway.
Rephrase.
Sure. As a physician, when you are thinking about administering a drug, do you need certain information in order to make that decision be the wisest and safest one?
Absolutely. The more complete and the more accurate information we can have, the safer it will be.
Did you see when you watched the body worn cameras, the police officers giving the paramedics information about the deterioration of Mr. McClain?
No.
What information could the police officers have given the paramedics that would have maybe paused them in giving the drug because they would have learned it wasn't safe?
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
Response.
Your Honor, I think the doctor can tell based on his experience and his foundation of the information that he would need in order to make this decision.
Well, I'll allow you to ask what he would need.
What would you need in this situation, based on this situation, if you were going to give the drug of ketamine? What would you have wanted to know about Mr. McClain's condition?
I think the most important thing would be that he had some sort of breathing problem, that he complained of shortness of breath, or that there was some problem noted about his breathing.
Would you have wanted to know the fact that his mental state had deteriorated?
Absolutely.
Would you have wanted to know how, to the degree his mental state deteriorated?
Yes.
Would you have wanted to know that he had vomited?
Yes.
Would you have wanted to know that there was vomit in the mask?
Yes.
Would you have wanted to know his position? Whether he was
Yes.
sitting up or laying down?
I think that might be a little less important, quite honestly, but yes, that would be helpful.
Did you see this information being relayed by any police officer to the paramedics?
No.
The defense counsel asked you some questions about your opinion today. Do you remember that line of questioning?
I don't know which specific one you're referring to.
She was talking about today you've made these opinions, or today you've testified to this.
Yes.
Do you believe that today your testimony is any different than your testimony in the past?
No.
Do you believe today your position is any different than your position in your prior report?
This is asking the witness to comment his own veracity or weight of his opinion.
Sustained.
I'm asking whether or not you believe you'll change your opinion.
No, and
I just sustain the objection.
In your past opinions, have you stated that the carotid hold caused a series of events to occur?
it's been my opinion all along that there were a series of events that contributed to the increased risk of the ketamine, which was the primary cause of death.
And can you remind the jury what those events were?
So it was certainly the aspiration and compromised lung function. It was the low oxygen that would have caused. It was the acidosis. And I don't believe I called out specifically the carotid hold, but that some of what was done to him to keep him in restraint significantly also contributed to his impairment and his inability to defend himself against these episodes of aspiration.
But for those events, would Elijah McClain be alive today?
But for which events?
The events that started off before the ketamine. If those events had not occurred, would Elijah McClain be alive?
Well, I mean, if he never interacted with police, he would obviously be alive. If he never got the ketamine, most likely he would have been alive. If he did not have any of these events, the chokehold, the aspiration,
Have to have that corrected. Chokehold, objection to the-
sorry,
All right, the record should
I
reflect
apologize.
it's carotid hold.
Just confirming I'm not an expert in the chokehold because I call it the wrong thing. I think I previously testified that if we walked up to Mr. McClain healthy and injected him with ketamine, more likely than not, he would have died from that large dose of ketamine.
You had a series of questions about small versus large aspiration.
Yes.
Your medical opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, does that issue really affect what happened to Mr. McClain?
No.
Why not?
Well, even smaller amounts of aspiration can cause impairment in the lungs and vulnerability. And then, particularly if it was a small amount of aspiration, but then you can't cough and you can't take deep breaths and you can't reposition yourself, that can become, the effects of that can become much worse. So it was not as much whether it was a big or small aspiration or when it occurred, but also the positioning and the inability to correct it.
You were asked questions about CPR. My question to you is, did the CPR that was conducted on Mr. McClain, did it lend itself or did it cause the aspiration?
I can't say for sure whether or not he had additional aspiration during the CPR, but it certainly could have happened.
Counsel asked you whether or not in 5 minutes you could have determined whether or not Mr. McClain was very sick. If you look at the chart and you look at the 5 minutes that you think you would have known as a layperson that he was very sick, what 5 minutes are those?
I think that point that we were just looking at when we said, that was the next page. Or maybe that next page. So exhibit 179, gurgling, less active, and then exhibit 188, sleepy, needs medical attention. I think all of us as lay people would look at him and say, oh boy, something's going on. If we saw him at a baseball game in that situation, we would think that he needed help.
2:58, some change, or 10:58, some. That's when that 5 minutes and beyond would have been like, we need to do something right now.
Yes.
You were asked a series of questions about tests.
Yes.
In this case, would you need a test to know how sick Mr. McClain was at 10:58 and some change?
Not at all.
In this case, would you have needed a test to know that Mr. McClain vomited?
No,
In this case, would you have needed a test to know that Mr. McClain vomited while wearing the mask?
no,
In this case, would you have needed a test to know that Mr. McClain was saying, "I can't breathe"?
no,
In this case, would you have needed a mask to determine that Mr. McClain could not fix himself?
no,
In this case, do you need a test to determine that Mr. McClain said, "Please help me"?
no.
And at,
Again, the court will instruct the jury that they're to determine what was said and who said it rather than counsel.
yes, Your Honor, thank you. And by 10:58 and some change, would you need a test to know that Mr. McClain was no longer in the recovery position, but was more prone to the grass?
No.
Thank you. I have nothing else.
May the witness be excused? All right, you may step down. You are excused. All right, we'll take our lunch break now, folks. Please recall what I've mentioned to you numerous times. Don't form or express any opinions, discuss the case. Do no independent research. Avoid any press coverage about this case or cases like this. Like to have you back in the jury assembly room, let's say 20 minutes after 1 o'clock. Like to have you back up here by 1:30.